we handed over to the Leningrad front the 6th Separate Brigade of Marines, about 5,000 sailors who came off the ships. On the ships under construction and coastal bases remained now only 30% of the personnel. The brigade went into battle first in the area of Strelna and Ligovo, and then was transferred to Volkhovstroy. On September 17th, the submarine M97, under the command of Lieutenant Commander A. Meinikov, returned safely from the reconnaissance of the Tallinn area. Her crew had perfectly fulfilled the task and illuminated us the situation in the Gulf of Finland. We could again conclude that the fascist fleet was not going to help its army near Leningrad. No large ships were seen anywhere. The sea was dead. This untied our hands, allowed us to throw all the forces of the fleet to support our armies fighting near Leningrad. And finally, scouted AI Milikov fairways promised the possibility of deploying submarines, and in the Baltic Sea sailors little did not limit themselves to reconnaissance. On the Tallinn roadstead they attacked and sank a fascist transport. Having reached the southern shore of the bay, the enemy sought to interrupt our sea communication Kronstadt-Leningrad. From Strelna to the head of the Sea Canal Dam was only 2 miles. This of course added to our troubles. But the battles fought by the enemy on the shore of the bay diverted his forces from the main thing. Our task was to prevent Hitlerites from withdrawing at least part of their troops from here. With the exit of the Nazis on the coast of the bay, the Oranian bomb patch, limited by a 60-kilometer arc from the Voronka River and the Kopo Bay to Peterhof, was finally formed. The depth of this bridgehead in the widest place did not exceed 25 kilometers. But it held firmly. And it was from him subsequently began our rapid offensive. The failure of the Nazi assault we distinguished more and more clearly. The voices of people became more resonant, more cheerful. And when late in the evening the duty officer of the cipher and staff service brought me the next report, I asked the bright red-haired, freckled lieutenant with a smile, "Well, what's new?" although there was nothing particularly new. To report today the fascists again intensively shelled Leningrad, but the front advanced to the city much less than in the previous days. Attacks on the Pulkovo heights have been repulsed. The fact that the enemy was entrenching, at least in small parts of the front, spoke volumes. But if a little quieter became on the land route, then over the fleet loomed a thunderstorm. On September 18th, massive fire of heavy guns fascists directed at our cruisers Maxim Gorky and Petropavlovsk, firing from a position in the Sea Canal. The guns of these ships caused much trouble to the enemy advancing on Legovo. The cruiser Maxim Gorky was standing at the wall of the Klebnii breakwater of the trade port when the Germans concentrated the fire of several batteries on it. Although shells were falling nearby, the cruiser did not stop firing. He even shot down an observation balloon raised by the Nazis for correction. But here a 150mm shell hit the cruiser, caused great damage and fire. The crew of the cruiser, perfectly prepared to fight for the survivability of the ship, extinguished the fire and eliminated the damage. The ship continued to fire. One interesting detail. When the ship was under fire of enemy artillery, its commander, Captain First Rankin Petrov, in a narrow, limited space managed to turn around and take the cruiser to a safe zone. But the length of the ship is 200 meters. In peacetime conditions, such a maneuver in the port was allowed only with the help of 2 strong tugs. The second cruiser Petropavlovsk was harder hit. It was not yet a completed ship, it lacked a number of mechanisms and devices. It did not have independent running, the bilge system did not work. At the beginning of the war was urgently put into operation only the artillery of the main caliber, and thus the cruiser was a strong floating battery. It was hit in a day by 8 shells of large caliber. Fires broke out, water rushed into the holes, temporary portable pumps could not pump out water in time, and the cruiser with a roll sat on the ground. Among the hundreds of guns of the fleet firing at the Nazis, it was a relatively small loss, but still a loss. One thing consoled: the cruiser fulfilled its duty to the end and made its contribution to the defense of Leningrad. In the midst of a brutal artillery cannonade, our radio stations received a dispatch, transmitted in open text in Russian by order of the Chief of Defense: immediately cease fire. This foolish provocation was immediately unravelled, and only raised the morale of the artillerymen. Obviously not from a good life Hitlerites let themselves on such a cheap trick. The sailors knew that the army and the fleet would stop their fire only after the complete and final defeat of the enemy. On September 19th, much earlier than usual over Kronstadt and the ships standing on the roadstead, appeared German spy planes. They were flying at a high altitude, and under them against the blue sky flashed white clouds from the bursts of anti-aircraft shells. The noise was incredible. Anti-aircraft guns were beating, it seemed, stronger than the heaviest guns. They, of course, prevented the scouts from descending, but it was not enough. It would be better to shoot down these airplanes, but alas, all the requests of the Korflot to strengthen Kronstadt with fighter aviation have not been satisfied yet. Although the whole course of events showed that the enemy was seriously engaged in the fleet and was preparing for powerful bombing attacks. Behind the scouts soon appeared bombers. From a great height they dropped the first bombs on Kronstadt. The Nazis were aiming at the battleship Marat, which was in the harbour. 4 bombs fell far from the battleship, 2 bombs behind the wall, on the small raid, and 2 bombs in the city, at the summer garden. On the whole, however, the damage was insignificant. No one was killed, or even wounded. The enemy for a long time shelled Oranienbaum harbour from large-caliber guns, Moskalenko lamented. Idiots, and why are they wasting shells? There are no ships in the harbour, 2 divisions long ago in Leningrad, only burn all my warehouses and destroy the piers. It really didn't make much sense for the Nazis to shell the harbour, but they didn't know that. Taking into account the tense situation in the Nevskaya Bay, a week ago Komflot ordered to urgently equip piers in Lysynoz for organisation of all necessary transportations along the line Leningrad-Lysyhok Oranienbaum. This way we now carried out and transportation of troops, and feeding everything necessary Oranienbaum patch, where many units of the 8th Army remained. The engineering department of the fleet built good piers, which were used not only during the German attack on Leningrad, but also later when concentrating troops on the Oranienbaum bridgehead to break the blockade. We did not stop using the sea canal. The fleet headquarters outlined a fairway along the northern shore of the bay for small ships, so that they, travelling between Leningrad and Kronstadt, passed, perhaps, further away from Strilna and Peterhof, where the enemy had already installed guns and searchlights. Since the sea canal was under enemy fire, boats, tugs and small warships heading for Leningrad now entered it by the ship or Petrovsky Fairway, and less often by the Yelaginsky Fairway. Sailors, workers of factories and workshops, and the whole population of Kronstadt were so accustomed to the reports of large raids and shelling of Leningrad, and to the night lights over the city, that the first bombs in Kronstadt did not surprise anyone. Boys collected shrapnel near the summer garden for memory, and climbing into the craters, measured their depth. The rhythm of urban life of the fortress city was not disturbed. The first raid on Kronstadt made us even more closely related to Leningraders. It seemed that some part of the bombs we took on ourselves, and they could fall on the streets of the long-suffering city on the Neva. I called my father on the phone, and in consolation said, "You see, now we are being bombed too, still it will be easier for you there." It was a joke, and no more, because on September 19th, there were 6 air raids and a long artillery bombardment in Leningrad during the day. More than 100 heavy shells were fired on the city, and about 2,000 high explosive and incendiary bombs were dropped. But this raid was not cheap for the fascists. 17 Junkers crashed on the outskirts of the city. Our best hopes were still justified. In the evening we received information from Leningrad that all German attacks were repulsed. Although the enemy furiously rushed forward, the results were deplorable. The wounded beast, bleeding, was rushing in front of the Leningrad stronghold. 300,000 Hitlerites' army is trampled on a place and passes to defense. Not without reason Hitler in those days hysterically shouted Lieb. Out of his mind, is not able to understand and realize my plan for the rapid capture of Leningrad. He is running around with his plan to take the defense in the northwest direction and proposes to develop an offensive in the center towards Moscow. Apparently he is clearly outdated, cowardly and, like a true Catholic, wants to pray to God, not to fight. The point, of course, was not Lieb, but the courage and fortitude of the Soviet people. The troops of the 42nd Army, defending the southwestern and southern approaches to the city, in cooperation with the Baltic Fleet, stopped the Nazis. The front of the army day and night supported 2 line ships, 3 cruisers, a leader and 4 destroyers, 4 gunboats, 12 batteries of medium and large caliber, and all this, combined, amounted to 127 guns. For 10 days of the German offensive, the artillerymen of the fleet fired more than 6,000 shells, and the fleet aviation, supporting our troops, made about 1,300 airplane sorties. Air reconnaissance reported that in the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic Sea, the Germans resumed transportation. Transports go unguarded or with a very weak escort. Apparently, the enemy decided that the Baltic Fleet is firmly locked in Kronstadt and Leningrad. Having carefully studied the situation at sea, the fleet headquarters reported its thoughts to the Komflot. At a meeting with the participation of the leading departments of the headquarters and submarine commanders, Komflot decided to immediately prepare for the campaign for action on the enemy's sea communications 15 submarines for their full autonomy. Submariners met this decision with enthusiasm. No one, of course, did not know when and where the submarines would go, but not to talk about the upcoming campaign, to make it a strict secret, was simply impossible, because every sailor had to participate in the preparation for the voyage. A submarine is a special ship. Here sometimes the fate of the entire crew depends on the skill of each sailor. I remember a case from the pre-war practice when a sailor failed to close the ventilation valve in time, and the boat crashed. Now, on the eve of a big campaign, at party meetings, communists consulted on how to better prepare all the combat stations of the ship to work for a long time in the most unforeseen conditions. Flagship specialists of the fleet headquarters helped submariners as much as they could. Representatives of the combat training department tested the knowledge of sailors' specialists, gave them advice on various occasions. The rear of the fleet supplied the ships with everything they needed, allocated them the best products. General Moskalenko came to the submarine brigade more than once a day and meticulously inquired from the ship commanders, "What else do you need? Have you received warm underwear for everyone? Did you get the smoked meat? Why don't you take herring? It's not a business." And then he'd stop the sailors passing by and ask them, "Does the crew like herring?" "That's right," they answered readily. And the general ordered the commander, Lieutenant Commander Vishnevsky, to take herring by all means. 5 submarines were scheduled to go out in the first turn. In the headquarters they sliced large areas of action, so as not to constrain the initiative of commanders in the choice of courses and in reconnaissance. Were studied and taken into account all the shortcomings in the use of boats for the first 2 months of the war. The positions covered the western, southern and eastern coastal parts of the Baltic Sea, as well as the mouth of the Gulf of Finland and the Tallinn-Helsinki area. The instruction, developed by the operational department of the fleet headquarters, contained instructions on the order of forcing the Gulf of Finland, on the areas to be passed in a surface or underwater position, day or night. The recommended courses were also given. Transitions were to be made in 2 stages up to Lavansari Island. The boats would go under the protection of minesweepers, and hunting boats further on they would go independently, guided by the instructions given to them. There was one more important detail: the submarines were deployed in an echeloned manner. The next submarine left Lavansari Island only after receiving a conditional short signal from the previous boat that it had safely entered the Baltic Sea. In addition to this signal, submarine commanders were ordered to maintain complete radio silence and not to go on the air without instructions. Looking ahead, I note that this signal failed us badly. September 20th, submarines Shh 319 and Shh 320 went to sea. Shh 320 safely reached the southern part of the Baltic Sea, but its signal we did not take, and this delayed for several days the output of the rest of the boats. While the fleet headquarters was in a very upset feelings, the commander of the Shh 320, Lieutenant Commander Vishnevsky, sank a large transport. The fascists panicked who could sink their ships in the deep rear. We learned about it from the press of neutral countries, which teased the domination of the Germans in the Baltic, assuring that the southern Baltic swarmed Soviet submarines. Shh 320 safely returned to base, and then it turned out that the headquarters did not receive a timely signal from her for technical reasons, completely independent of the submariners. Our submarines were deployed according to the plan, and during the fall of 1941, up to the freezing of the Gulf of Finland, inflicted damage to the enemy, and most importantly, exposed before the world fascist bullshit about the blockade and destruction of the Baltic Fleet. Not only the deployment of submarines' significant autumn, gloomy day of September 20th. Early in the morning from the land route came requests for artillery fire. All ships, forts and railroad batteries fired. We fired on both the north and south shore. With the support of the fleet artillery troops of the 23rd Army knocked the enemy out of Belustrov. On this section of the front, the enemy was firmly pressed into the ground along the line of our old state border, along the Sestra River, and until the beginning of our offensive in 1944, did not give, as they call it, any signs of life. Hundreds of shells drilled the sky over the bay. Under this peculiar fire roof we safely transported from Oranienbaum to Leningrad an artillery regiment from the 8th Army units. Our fighters reliably covered from the air the ships, crowded with people and equipment. The enemy aircraft dropped several bombs on a small rocky island of Summers, located east of Gogland. Only our observation post was stationed on the island. No one was harmed by this bombing, but the bomb fragments slightly scratched 2 of our torpedo boats that remained in formation. This motoring of the enemy from side to side only confirmed his confusion from the failures near Leningrad. Our ships continued the large mine laying begun in early September. Thousands of mines blocked the approaches to Kronstadt in Kopo Bay, Luga Bay, under the northern shore at Cape Störsudden and in the Björkesund Strait. The day of September 21st did not portend anything special. It was quiet and sunny. In the morning a German aerial scout appeared in the sky. As usual, our anti-aircraft guns slammed, an unimaginable noise arose, and the scout disappeared. Ships were entering the harbour after night mine, laying on the outskirts of Kronstadt. A report was received that a patrol boat, a hydrographic ship and 6 motorboats with meat and medicines, arrived safely to Hanko base from Kronstadt. From Levensari another submarine went to Gogland as planned to reconnoitre the area. The fleet was firing on the front of the north and south shores. In short, our usual combat day was beginning. True, the enemy's aerial reconnaissance seemed to us more persistent than usual. The airplane kept high and repeatedly crossed Kronstadt from south to north, and back again anti-aircraft guns were firing again, and a couple of our fighters were chasing the fascist. Alas, to no avail. The scout soon left in the direction of Peterhof and was gone. At this time the line ship October Revolution was going along the sea canal to Kronstadt, and from its 12-inch guns was continuously firing at the fascists in the area of Lygov. At 12 o'clock in the afternoon the ship was on the traverse of Peterhof. At that time a rolling explosion came to our ears. I looked out of the window. Sailors and workers passing along the street rushed to run towards the Petrovsky Park. Someone shouted a battleship exploded. And this news immediately travelled all over the house. They reported from the observation post a big explosion was seen on the tank of the battleship October Revolution, but it continued to fire its main caliber and went down the channel to Kronstadt. Flames and smoke cover the ship. Several dozen enemy planes are circling over it. The battleship is firing anti-aircraft fire at them. Fleet commander ordered me and my deputy FV, Zozulia, to go out on the boat, to clarify what ships are on the roadstead, and disperse them, because at any minute you can expect a repeat of the enemy raid. Bypassing the raid and giving orders, we on a fast staff boat EMB flew up to the battleship. The fire on the tank had already been extinguished, but the entire deck was turned from the bow to the first turret. Steel plates were sticking out on both sides. The explosion had destroyed the spire and all the anchor gear, but the anchor chain, which had survived intact, had been blown overboard for its entire length. The ship, however, using her strong machinery, continued forward, dragging the anchor along the bottom. We approached the gangway. The ship had just fired the last salvo of its main caliber. The anti-aircraft guns had fallen silent. Large black balls slowly rose on the battleship's rails, which meant that she had stopped running. We went up on deck. Despite the damage, a formidable, imposing look was our Oktobrina. All the windlasses were removed, the davits were blocked, the davits were removed from the deck, and the large entrance hatches were closed. Underfoot, like snakes, snaked the fire hoses that had been dispersed on the Alert. The artillery turrets looked to port toward the enemy. The smooth, Large, clean deck was empty. All the sailors were at their posts in the bowels of this steel giant. Only at the anti-aircraft guns froze men in iron helmets. The commander of the battleship, Rear Admiral Mikhail Zakharovich Moskalenko, my old comrade of my young naval years, was hurrying towards us with small, quick steps. Having dismissed the official report, I asked him what happened. We quickly go with him to the tank, and Mikhail Zakharovich on the way tells me that from behind the clouds came a whole flock of airplanes. 3 bombs hit the bow. The ship did not lose its fighting ability. Weapons and vehicles are still in service. Bastards tore up the tank. There are wounded and killed. We reached the first turret. We couldn't go any farther. The ship's tank had been torn apart, a monstrous wound gaping almost to the bottom, with mangled and twisted iron, pipelines, burnt parts of mechanisms sticking out. It smelled of burning. Not all the dead and wounded have not yet managed to extract from this chaos. I handed over to the commander of the battleship the order of the Komflot to go for repairs in Kronstadt. He did not need any encouraging words. By all that and how things were done around, I saw that this is a stronger, welded team of real sailors. No bombs could take them out of balance. The battleship's military commander, Pyotr Yakovlevich Savin, who proved to be an excellent organizer, came up to me. "A little bit damaged," he said calmly. "Well, nothing. The repair will not be long. The team will help the plant. The cannons are intact. That's the main thing." Powerful tugs came to the bow and stern of the battleship, but it was dangerous to move further. Forts and ships on the roadsteads again bellowed 100 anti-aircraft guns. The pale blue September sky was at once dotted with white caps of bursts. Several groups of bombers were approaching. We moved away from the battleship, and for one moment it seemed that it was our big white boat that was being bombed. The bombs were falling very close, and their fragments were flying through us. Captain First Rank Zozulia went to the bridge of the boat to watch the correctness of the petty officer's maneuvers. We gave 20 knots, and in a few seconds all the splashes from the bombs remained astern. But now, to our surprise, in front of the bow of the boat, rushing south, began to grow small candles, apparently from the fall of medium-caliber shells. Where did they come from? Someone noticed the flashes on the outskirts of Peterhof. We turned around again, and now we were flying at full speed towards the eastern raid. Always cheerful F.E. Zozulia leaned over the bridge railings and, overpowering the roar of 2 aircraft engines of the boat, shouted to me. "Look." He pointed with his hand at the destroyers. One of them was shrouded in smoke and burning, slowly sinking and lying on board. We went around the east side of the small raid and the ships fought off air attacks with fire. Muffled explosions were heard in the city. Fire was blazing and clouds of black smoke with round caps floated into the sky. Obviously the fascists took seriously for the fleet and its main base. When we approached, the crippled destroyer removed the last wave of enemy bombers. Immediately the anti-aircraft guns fell silent. The fire on the destroyer stopped. The ship with a large roll sat on the ground shallow eastern roadstead. Approaching the board, we recognized the commander of the destroyer Steregoshi Captain 2nd Rank Zbritsky and Regimental Commissar Malyavkin. Both were bandaged and, like Negroes, black with soot. Short round-faced Zbritsky spread his hands. One big bomb straight into the ship. That's all. We understood what tension these modest people experienced, seeing the death of their native ship. Therefore, without any questioning, I ordered, first of all, to load all the wounded onto our boat. Last, we took off the wounded commander and commissar of the destroyer. E.P. Zbritsky held up well. He even did not lose his sense of humour. Going around the wounded, he joked with them. Half jokingly, half seriously, Zbritsky pointed at the small mast of the boat. "We are sailing under the flag of the Komflot. It's a great honour for us," and winked slyly at me. I looked and froze. Indeed, on the mast fluttered a scarlet flag with 3 white stars arranged in a triangle. I note that in the Navy every senior chief has his own flag. This is an ancient and strict rule, which is strictly followed. Flag Komflot with 3 stars belongs only to him, and without his permission cannot be raised anywhere. The Chief of Staff of the fleet is entitled to only 2 stars on the flag. What's the matter? I angrily asked the chief officer of the boat. He was also perplexed and ordered the sailor signaller to lower the flag immediately. In my heart, I was very dissatisfied with this oversight. It turned out that we were impostors running all over the raid. And what was our general surprise when the signalman unfurled the flag in front of us, and we saw 2 white stars on it, and next to them a hole from a small piece of shrapnel. Zbritsky's teeth and whites of laughing eyes glittered dazzlingly on his smoked face. Comrade Chief of Staff, this is a very good omen. You will definitely command the fleet. I did not give then the meaning of this joke, but more than 10 years later, when I commanded the Pacific Fleet E.P. Zbritsky, chief of the marching staff on a large exercise, came up to me on the bridge of the cruiser and reminded me. You see, I was right then. Now on your flag the 3rd star is already real, not a hole from a shrapnel. We were on our way to the small raid when the big raid started again. A dozen bombers raided the transport standing here. Bombs were falling everywhere. The boat shuddered incessantly, the water blown up by the explosions flooded the deck. We were worried about the wounded, they needed urgent medical help, and the hospital was still far away. The next waves of bombers dropped their cargo on the warships and on Kronstadt. Again we were deafened by unimaginable cracking of anti-aircraft guns and deafening heavy blasts of explosions. We were going at full speed along a small old transport Maria, and at that moment it was hit by a bomb. In an instant the transport is blown away like a dandelion from a breeze, and its wreckage is hidden under the water. The wounded on the deck of the boat are nervous. Calm them as we can. We gave full speed, the boat goes on the redan and flies among the chaos of splashes. No sooner had we moored at Petrovskaya Wharf than the 4th raid began. The cruiser Kirov, destroyer Gordy and submarine Sheich 306 received minor damage. Significant losses in the city. Many wounded and killed in the factory, on the streets, in the coastal marine units. In the evening, compiling a detailed report on air raids, I spoke with the head of the rear of the fleet, General Moskalenko. Mitrofan Ivanovich was obviously upset. His farm had suffered great damage. Fascist bombs destroyed the factory of artillery instruments, warehouses, set fire to oil tanks. Fires covered 10 houses. All night the fire was fought with fire. Sailors rendered assistance to the victims, saved the fleet property. The naval hospital was especially damaged. According to all the data, it turned out that the fascists were aiming at it on purpose. In one day, 180 enemy planes raided Kronstadt and ships. This had never happened before. German losses 10 bombers. Although we had only 5 fighter planes, pilots Kostylev, Yusichenko, Tikichov, Rudenko and Elvov bravely entered the battle, and in front of the whole fleet shot down more than 1 Junkers. The casualties on shore could have been immeasurably less if the Air Defence Service, the system of shelters and warning were at the proper height. And here there was a lot of disorganization. During the raids, crowds of Gurkhas stood at street intersections and watched the bombs fall. Komflot again appealed to the commander of Lenfront with a request to strengthen the Kronstadt naval base with fighter aviation, but unfortunately we were again refused because the air raids on Leningrad did not stop. By evening the anti-aircraft guns were silenced, but the rumble of cannonade was still in the air. Battleship Marat, cruiser Kirov and forts were firing methodically at the fascists. Under the rumble of cannonade our toilers of the sea, fast hunting boats, having taken a new stock of barrage mines, with the onset of darkness went to the west. For the second time they bravely and boldly, under the very nose of the enemy put their deadly balls in his rear, on the fairways of the Vyborg Bay. The port of Vyborg was thus closed for military transportation of fascists. This we reliably strengthened our northern flank of the sea defence of the approaches to Kronstadt. The night was cool and starry. We were sitting in the headquarters garden. Our working day had not ended. Assistant Chief of Staff Captain First Rank V. F. Cherney often came up and reported on various requests from institutions and units. Some asked for a team of sailors to replace those already working on excavation of collapsed houses. Others asked to send sailors to clear the rubble formed in the streets. During the night, it was necessary to restore at least elementary order in the city. People were exhausted. We had no experience in reconstruction work at that time. Always collected, cheerful VF. Cherney received instructions from Conflot and left to pass them to the units. In the darkness, we heard a loud bass. "Where is Conflot?" The assistant on duty at headquarters' small, darkened flashlight illuminated the figure of General Moskalenko. He came to report how friendly, assertive people were working at the factory of artillery devices, clearing the rubble, saving the equipment. They are dead tired. It is necessary to help them urgently. When he heard that he would be assigned sailors, the general thanked him and disappeared into the darkness. Already from afar came his indignant voice. "You can't see a damn thing." This is not the case. We should whitewash the stones on the side of the path and install blue lanterns. Our head of the rear everywhere, and always remained a caring, and therefore picky master. Reports came in. Orders were given, their fulfillment was checked. The night flew by in troubles. The glow of fires over Peterhof and the southern part of Leningrad dimmed. Heavy guns of ships and forts were firing methodically at enemy positions. Voices were silent, officers and sailors were dozing in their places, only the duty service of the headquarters posts was awake. And at 5:15 a.m. the harbour was again filled with the sounds of the air alarm, played on dozens of horns to the accompaniment of the bells of the loud battle. On the radio carried two menacing words: air alarm. Air alarm. Everyone was on their feet. The fortress was bristling with the barrels of anti-aircraft guns. A few rare, as if embarrassed, shots timidly sounded in the cool morning air. The Nazi scout passed high and quickly disappeared. The day began quiet and clear. Another raid was to be expected. Conflot ordered to warn all anti-aircraft batteries and ships on the raids, as well as our fighters at the airfield Bulls Field, located outside the city in the western part of the island of Kotlin, to be in constant readiness. The air alert was sounded soon enough, and our usual scabby business resumed. Today ended the formation of the 7th Independent Marine Brigade of 5,000 men. Colonel T.M. Parafilo, who in Tallinn headed the 1st Marine Brigade, took command of the brigade. Experienced political worker Regimental Commissar Greatchev, who had distinguished himself in the war with the White Finns, was appointed military commissar. The brigade was sent near Leningrad to the positions near the Izhora River and successfully acted together with the 55th Army. Together with this brigade, more than 80,000 envoys of the fleet fought on the land route. They could be found on all parts of the Leningrad front, and even near Moscow. Since 8 in the morning again, opened fire battleship Marat and cruiser Kirov on the southern coast and Kronstadt forts on the northern coast. And suddenly the quiet rumble of the cannonade was broken into by the unusual sounds of sharp bursts, quite unlike the explosions of airplane bombs. Through the window I saw a tall water candle rising above the thinning foliage of Petrovsky Park. The enemy was beating from heavy guns from the southern bank. The fire was conducted on the ships on the roadstead and on the naval plant. Part of the shells fell in the city. The shelling was unexpected for Kronstadt, and therefore there were casualties, especially at the naval plant. The ships received only minor damage, which did not affect their fighting ability. Of course, the return fire of the fleet and coastal batteries on the fascists did not stop for a minute. Conflot ordered the Chief of Fleet Artillery, Rear Admiral I. Gren, to immediately take measures to suppress the batteries that were shelling Kronstadt. Fleet headquarters, using the Tallinn experience, began to organize a system of smoke in the most important areas of the fortress and ships. This measure was also useful here. It confused the enemy. His fire became ineffective. At 3 p.m. the air alarm signals were again sounded. About 40 fascist planes appeared in the clear white sky among white flakes of anti-aircraft shells bursts. Some were dive-bombing the ships, others were dive-bombing the naval plant. Bombs fell like peas from a bag. And immediately we saw a black plume behind the German airplane, which turned away into the sea and soon fell apart. There was noise and shouts of approval all around. Meanwhile, the ground shook. Bombs were exploding quite close. Reports began to come in. At the Morzavod, the dock wall was destroyed. Shrapnel hit the floating submarine base Smolny, destroyers menacing and strong, as well as one of the submarines and minesweeper. Today, especially assertive acted 6 of our fighters. The pilots upset the fighting order of enemy planes, resolutely rushed at them, shot down 8 junkers. Many Nazis were forced to throw bombs into the water. And yet 6 fighters could not block the way to 4 dozen dive bombers. Immediately after the alarm went off, the dangerous and arduous recovery work in the fortress began. Some of the bombs were retarded. Worked the entire city, the entire fleet, especially labour-intensive, was the repair of the electrical system at the Morzavod and the docks. And the heavy guns of battleships, cruisers and forts continued to alternately conduct methodical fire on the enemy on the southern and northern shores. No raids can drown out the fascists, our guns, said the sailors. Not a single bomb or shell has hit the fleet headquarters yet. This is sheer luck. After all, a large, beautiful white house, all its facade overlooked the south side, and was perfectly visible not only from Peterhof, but also from all the heights located behind it. Taking into account the artillery shelling and bombing of the fortress, it was decided to move the military council and the headquarters of the fleet, as well as all the central administration on the outskirts of the city. For the fleet headquarters were allocated barracks of coastal defence units on the western outskirts of the city. In the courtyard of this military town in a separate house located, and the military council. A few dozen metres away was the underground command post of the fortress air defence. Part of it was occupied by the operational duty officers of the fleet headquarters. However, even during air raids or heavy shelling of Kronstadt, we used this reliable shelter very little. Only in the morning, and in the evening we, with the head of the operational department, Pilipovsky, came here to study the general situation in the theatre, developed overnight or during the day. All current operational work was carried out in the headquarters ground barracks. A thing of the past, but it was worth falling on the middle of the courtyard 1 bomb or 2 heavy shells, and from the fleet command and its headquarters would be only memories. Unfortunately, unnecessary dash was characteristic at first even of large military chiefs. So our old headquarters house at the Italian pond finally emptied, and the next day its walls were first wounded by shrapnel bombs and shells. Most of the windows were blown out by the blast wave. It must be that the owners had left in time. I accidentally met the writer Vsevolod Vishnevsky near the house. He was carefully counting the number of hits and concentrating all this in his notebook. September 23rd, 1941 is marked in my diary as an unprecedentedly hard, truly tragic day of our existence. It was not by chance that this short, heart-wrenching entry was born. Such days leave a strong notch in the memory for life. It is again a wonderful, quiet, sunny morning of golden autumn. The air is fragrant and fresh. I said quiet morning, for we paid no attention to the incessant cannonade of the heavy guns of battleships, cruisers and forts. It would have seemed simply strange if it had not been heard. I do not know whether in response to our fire or independently of it, but the enemy began an intensive artillery bombardment of the city, mainly of the naval factory and the ships on the raids. We were putting up smoke screens, the Nazi fire was thinning. In contrast to the usual did not appear air reconnaissance. Rear Admiral I. Gren calls from Leningrad, checking and clarifying what ships and forts are firing. Taking the opportunity, I ask, how are things in Leningrad? Thank you, fine. The ships in the Neva are firing. Now began a strong counterfire on the city, especially the trade port and the cruiser Maxim Gorky. There has already been 1 air alert. We expect more raids. And how are things at the front? Apparently they've stopped. We're taking out all his heavy batteries. But he's still trying to attack, flailing about. Ivan Ivanovich's voice is much more cheerful than before. After the conversation with Gren, I reported to Komflotu morning's situation in the theatre, received his instructions, but Vice Admiral detained me. I will still achieve fighter aviation for Kronstadt, he said decisively. Go now to Bull's Field and check whether it is ready to receive fighters and accommodation of pilots. I handed over the current documents for execution to the head of the operations department, and myself on a small Olympic went to the airfield. It was located outside the city, in the western part of the island, which before the revolution was a dacha. There had never been an airfield there before. The war forced it to be created. We drive slowly. Asphalt sidewalks did not exist in Kronstadt then, and the streets paved with large cobblestones were in bad condition. In the vicinity we hear heavy bursts, the car shudders a little, the young driver sailor Moiseev is visibly nervous, looking around, fearing how not to get under a German shell. As soon as we left the city, I see one by one our air forces, all 6 fighters, are rising up. Apparently an air raid, says to me Adjutant Lieutenant Petukov. I did not have time to answer, as at once on the shore and on the ships standing in the distance on the roadstead crackled anti-aircraft guns. The sun was blinding my eyes, and the Nazi planes were not yet visible, although I had a premonition that most likely they would appear from under the sun. And so it happened. Another 2 or 3 minutes passed, and several dozen bombers appeared in the sky between the white clouds of anti-aircraft gun bursts. By the sounds of explosions, and by the thick black smoke, I realized again they were bombing the naval hospital and the naval plant. And the chauffeur nods towards the sea. Look, Comrade Admiral, what big candles over there, away from the grand raid. At full throttle we flew into the airfield. At the command post, the duty officer reported up to 40 dive bombers over Kronstadt. We are watching them. 2 junkers turned away into the sea and with black smoke burning crash into the water. Duty officer, with a triumphant look, reports that both planes are shot down by our fighters. The ground continues to shudder. Bombers come in waves as soon as one group of planes bombed off. Another one comes, and again bombs are flying. Again muffled explosions are heard. The raid lasts a long time. There is no alarm yet, but it seems to me anti-aircraft guns are firing less often and gradually fall silent. Having toured the airfield, having examined all its dugouts and huts, having clarified all possibilities of receiving additional airplanes, we decided to return faster. We can take even a whole regiment, the pilots told us, but let's hurry up. It's a shame that the enemy impudently flies, and we can do nothing. We don't have enough forces. They are right, 6 Hawks against dozens of bombers. It's a shame for our humble heroes. I couldn't promise them anything, because I knew that it's not from a good life. I had to go to the Chief of Rear General Moskalenko, and with him to clarify everything that concerns material support and living arrangements for pilots, if they will be sent to Kronstadt. The city was noticeably emptied, people became conscious of discipline, the service of MPVO was now working more clearly, and in an organized manner. The inhabitants were no longer carelessly walking along the streets. Only curfew cars, firemen, sanitary and military trucks were passing by. A stamp of gloomy business-likeness lay on the old city, and tension was felt in everything. About 11 o'clock we drove up to the rear of the fleet. On the ships in the military harbour again rumbled anti-aircraft guns, and then they were picked up by long-range batteries. It was not reasonable to take shelter during the bombardment in a simple old house, which stood almost near the ships, and we drove straight into Petrovsky Park on the Olympic. Somewhere there must be gaps. But where are they? We found the park empty, and could not find any cracks. The frantic crack of anti-aircraft guns and the very close bursts of bombs captured our attention. The fascists were making the biggest raid on Kronstadt. Under our feet the ground was no longer shuddering, but was shaking. When the bombs fell on the naval plant, besides the rumble of explosions we could hear the clang of iron and the rumble of collapses. We were standing not far from the monument to Peter the Great, under a large tree decorated with autumn gilding. Above my head I suddenly heard a child's anxious cry. Uncle Admiral. Look, they are flying to us. They are flying. I raised my head and marvelled. Quite high on the branches sat a few boys. They stretched out their hands in the direction of approaching airplanes to us. Get down at once, you little devils, I shouted, but my words made no impression, and only the little one who sat below them all answered importantly. No. Down there is nothing to see, and it's scary. I thought, here they are, our boys sung by Gaidar. They're the kind that make heroes, wherever you meet them. A big bomb fell into the water near the factory. A gigantic water column flew into the air with a noise. Junkers raided in groups. One bombed the naval plant and the hospital, another the ships on the Grand Raid, and the third, the largest group, hovered over the military harbour, forming a closed circle, which our pilots nicknamed Damn Carousel. The planes took turns dropping out of the circle, dive-bombed and bombed the ships. And from the tree again heard children's voices. Uncle Admiral. Look, it's falling. It caught fire. It's ours shot down. I did not see the falling junkers, but in my heart rejoiced. Several dozen airplanes, circling among the mass of white clouds of anti-aircraft bursts, one by one begin to dive on the battleship Marat. Explosions one after another. Flames burst from the bow of the ship. Again explosions, and again huge clouds of fire. I can clearly see how the huge Fock mast with gangways, chambers, bridges and platforms, solidly dotted with figures in white sailors' uniforms, slowly separates from the ship, not very quickly rolls to the side, and then split into pieces and with a rumble collapses into the water. Just below the mast, the gun turret has risen just as slowly, its 3 12-inch guns breaking apart and also flying into the water. The bay seems boiling from the mass of red-hot steel thrown into it. The bow of the battleship has disappeared. Its first tube is not visible. Hundreds of heads float in the water, a cloud of smoke hanging above them. And no matter how fiercely the anti-aircraft guns beat, I can clearly hear the growing rumble of human voices. I'm scared. I rush across the road to the rear department, call the BFKP, order immediately all sanitary cars to Rogatka and Petrovsky Park. Dinghi's boats, tugs were already lifting sailors out of the water. Baltic fighters continuously attacked the fascists. But what could 6 of our aces do against the whole armada of dive bombers? They shot down a few planes. The rest were gone. As if with a giant knife, the whole bow of the battleship was cut off up to the second turret. The ship went to ground. 3 of her other turrets remained standing. One wonders at the power and durability of these ships of old Russian construction. When I went up to the battleship, the deck was already cleaned up, everything was lying and standing in its place. And only coming to the second tower, I found myself on the edge of the abyss. Here the deck broke off. There was no ship beyond that. I was standing above a vertical wall. It seemed that you could see the ship in a section, and ahead the sea. Looking ahead, I will say that in a few days the guns of the second, third and fourth turrets of the Marat again crushed the enemy, and the sailors wrote on the shells with chalk for the wounds of our ship. In my youth, since 1921, I sailed for several years on the Marat as a senior navigator, and now it was hard, very hard to see the maimed native ship. And life was already boiling around. The endurance and organization of 1,000 people of the battleship did not shake. About 200 commanders, petty officers and sailors were wounded and killed. Killed and the commander of the ship, a fine sailor, Captain Second Rank Ivanov. He was on alert in the forward-fighting deckhouse, and here death caught up with him. We were returning to the command post. We had to bypass deep bomb craters. The streets were covered with heaps of rubble. In some places water pipes were broken and fountains of water were rising from the ground. The naval plant and the hospital, shrouded in flames and smoke, made a terrible impression. The raids of dive bombers with small intervals continued all day and evening. Far past midnight we summarized the rather sad results of the day and prepared a report to the headquarters of the Len Front and to Moscow. Komflot pedantically and consistently questioned pilots and commanders of air defense why almost immediately after the air alert signal bombs fell on the ships. What is it, Prolop? Observation or something else? Interrogated the admiral. It turned out that the enemy used a clever tactical technique. Airplanes flew from our own airfields, now occupied by the Germans. They first went to Peterhof, then sharply changed course, turning to Kronstadt. The distance from Peterhof they flew in minutes, and suddenly found themselves over the city and ships. This explains that the air alert was announced only 1 or 2 minutes before the bombing. On September 23rd, and during the night of September 24th, only 272 dive bombers raided Kronstadt. The naval factory and the naval hospital were badly damaged. There were hits in the minesweeper Oka, in the destroyer Grozny. 200-kilogram bombs exploded on the cruiser Kirov. However, all ships remained in service. Worse was the case with the leader Minsk. He sat on the ground, fortunately, in a shallow place. Wrecked transport and one submarine, standing in repair. Our pilots and anti-aircraft gunners shot down 14 fascist bombers. Air raids on Kronstadt did not suppress the fire of forts and ships. Our shells flew at the enemy. At night, when there was a lull, I talked on the phone with Rear Admiral Gren. "How are things in Leningrad, Ivan Ivanovich? And what's going on in Kronstadt?" I told him about our events and asked him, "And why over Leningrad again the glow?" The Admiral replies sparingly, "Today is a record day, 11 air alerts. One of them lasted 7 hours. I think they hit the Gostiny Divor, the bastards, but the ships were not damaged." Yes, it seems that September 23rd was equally hard day of the war for Leningrad and Kronstadt, and yet the enemy did not break the tenacity of the defenders of the city of Lenin, did not destroy our fleet, and did not undermine the morale of sailors. After all that happened, the 6th Air Defence Regiment with 60 fighter planes immediately arrived in Kronstadt. We were unspeakably happy about it, but somewhere in the depths of our hearts there was a feeling of annoyance. If only the Hawks had arrived earlier. At the operators of the fleet headquarters in those days came into use joking expression fire. It meant that their superiors ordered to stop any current work and to throw all their energies into solving a new task. It should be performed urgently, immediately, out of turn. The head of the operational department gathers all his assistants and half jokingly, half seriously announces, "Comrades, another fire. No one is grabbing for minimaxes. Everyone understands that the started work should be stuffed into safes and wait for new orders. And this notion is by no means local Baltic. I heard the word fire half joking, half skeptical in headquarters in the north, on the Black Sea, on the Pacific Ocean, and even in Moscow. We received information that in the vicinity of the Swedish island of Öland in the Baltic Sea detected going full speed northward fascist line ship Tirpitz with destroyers and torpedo boats. None of us in the headquarters was not surprised or concerned. Our radio reconnaissance was ordered to follow the movement of the battleship, and that was all we thought it necessary to do for the time being. But the High Command looked at the matter quite differently, deciding that the battleship goes not just to the north, and in the Gulf of Finland in order to defeat our front and the fleet near Leningrad. Therefore we were ordered to take immediate action, make a plan to repel the enemy attack, and hastily deploy all the forces of the fleet. When I called the head of the operational department and announced it to him, Grigory Efimovich Pilipovsky looked at me with big eyes. "Is it serious? You are not joking?" "Unfortunately, I'm not joking," I replied. "Call the officers, bring the map urgently. We will make preliminary calculations and report to the Komflot." Pilipovsky did not leave. "What is not clear to you?" I asked. Grigory Yefimovich frowned. "Comrade Rear Admiral, the entire Gulf of Finland, and especially its eastern part, mined that soup with dumplings. We put 10,000 mines, but the fascists poured more than 1,000. Our batteries on Hanko, Odensholm, on the islands and on the southern coast near Oranienbaum are in full combat readiness. Will the battleship Tirpitz go into this thicket? What does it want here? It would be suicide for him to come here." I interrupted Pilipovsky. "You're absolutely right. Let's not argue. In Smolny the decision to deploy the fleet has already been made, and if so, our business with you to fulfill. All the better if the fascist battleship will get to us in the eastern part of the bay. It's a sure death for him." That was the end of our conversation. And further in the headquarters began operational fire. The commander of the squadron, commanders of submarine brigades and torpedo boats were urgently summoned to Komflot. The plan to repel the attack of the battleship had to be drawn up today, and in the evening Komflot supposed to report it to the Military Council of the Front. The work boiled over. Various calculations were made on the map, orders were drawn up. We did not pay attention to the intense enemy fire, to air raids, 3 times repeated throughout the day. By the way, this time only single airplanes broke through to the ships and the city. The raid was ineffective for the Germans. Most of the bombs fell into the water without harming us. Our fighters were now more numerous, and they were excellent in aerial combat, having shot down 2 enemy planes. So the plan to repel attacks Tirpitz was made. Based on the decision of the commander of the fleet, began to deploy forces. On the radio transmitted the order to bring to combat readiness batteries Island Osmasa and Hanko. Torpedo boats were sent to General Kabanov to reinforce the Hanko naval base. 4 submarines went to positions in Narva Bay and on the western Gogland Pleasure. 2 submarines on Gogland Island were on hourly readiness to leave and 3 on Levensari Island. The destroyers and 6 submarines at Kronstadt made up the Konflott reserve, being also on hourly readiness. The leader Leningrad, with a detachment of torpedo boats, stood in readiness for departure on Levensari Island. An ambush of torpedo boats was organized on Bolshoi Tutas Island. In addition, the headquarters of the Lenfront allocated bomber aviation. A large group of ships, consisting of basic minesweepers and hunter boats, carried out mine laying near the islands of Summers and Seskar on the way of possible movement of the Nazi battleship. On September 27th, the deployment of the fleet was completed. We were very worried about torpedo boats, but they passed safely to Hanko. Thus, everything was ready. We are waiting for a day, 2nd, 3rd, and the fascist battleship is not there as it is not. The enemy daily conducts intensive artillery fire on ships in Kronstadt and on the devastated Oranienbaum harbour. We in turn put smoke screens, then the fascists temporarily silence. As soon as the veil thinned, they open fire again. And the battleship is still gone. What intelligence data about the battleship? Asked Konflott, who had just returned by boat from Leningrad. No data. As well as the battleship itself, I replied. Admiral is not angry, he understands everything well. The situation became clear much later. In the war there are different curiosities. So we were waiting for the fascist squadron at home, on the doorstep of our home near Kronstadt, and the fascists, lurking, waiting for us, and set their nets in the northern Baltic. They believed that exactly in these days our Baltic fleet would leave Leningrad and Kronstadt and rush to intern in Sweden. Apparently this was in the plans of Hitler's admirals, and as we know, any plan, including a stupid one, was a dogma for the fascists. So they decided to give battle to our fleet in the northern part of the Baltic Sea. September 24th in Abomination Skerries came a squadron of battleship Tirpitz, heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer, light cruisers Nuremberg and Cologne with destroyers, minesweepers, torpedo and patrol boats. Another squadron of light forces consisting of cruisers Emden and Leipzig with 2 destroyers by this time came to Libava. At the Finnish airfields concentrated dive bombers. The Germans had calculated everything in order to intercept and destroy our fleet, but only they did not know the most important thing, that we were not going to go anywhere. Until September 27th, the fascist squadron stood in readiness in Abomination Skerries and in Libava, not even trying to stick its nose in the Gulf of Finland, and then left without bread. We kept our forces in the sea much longer and their curtailing was finished only in the middle of October. We waited for the enemy, and the enemy waited for us. That's how it happens sometimes. On September 27th, the Germans bombed Kronstadt for the last time. 50 bombers came, they again aimed at the line ships, dropped about 100 bombs, and most of them, into the water. But our fighters and anti-aircraft gunners were much more successful and shot down several planes. At this point, the fascists ended their mass raids on Kronstadt and the fleet, having decided, obviously, that the game was not worth the candle. The fascist army near Leningrad was stopped. It was entrenching itself, preparing to move to the defence, but still the fleet artillery did not give it rest. Our Oranienbaum heel was firmly entrenched. The enemy was exhausted here too, made no attempts to attack, but only daily conducted a methodical artillery attack on harbours and ships on the roadstead. And although there was still fighting along the whole front, especially in the area of Uritskake, Pulkovo, Kolpino, it was clear that we had won the battle. The fascist armies, advancing through the Baltic to Leningrad, by the end of September lost more than 190,000 soldiers and officers, 500 guns and 700 tanks killed and wounded. A significant share of these losses inflicted on the enemy, the fleet could rightfully write on their own account. Our joy was overshadowed by reports from the island of Sarima. The enemy pressed our units that had retreated to the Sierv Peninsula. The German fleet shelled their positions from the sea, aviation bombed from the air. The Baltic held on. They were encouraged by the fact that in our hands remained the island of Dago with all the batteries and a strong garrison. The defenders of the Sierv Peninsula defended every metre of land and dealt crushing blows to the enemy. On the morning of September 27th, an enemy auxiliary cruiser and 6 destroyers entered Lubei for another bombardment of our positions. The fascists apparently thought that they would not meet any opposition, so the cruiser calmly anchored, preparing to open fire. The destroyers, however, kept on the move morosely. Our batteries from Sierv and Rahust, ahead of the enemy, the first to open fire. At the same time rushed to attack a detachment of 4 torpedo boats under the command of Senior Lieutenant V. P. Gumanenko. P. Gumanenko. The enemy aviation tried to sink the Soviet boats, but our fighters came to their rescue. There were only 2 of them, but they were controlled by fearless and skillful pilots. The Nazi attack planes fled in disgrace. Meanwhile, under the cover of smokescreens, boats approached the enemy ships. Boat Lieutenant N.N. Kremensky 2 torpedoes sank a destroyer. Lieutenant B.P. Ushchev 1 torpedo hit the cruiser, another in the destroyer type Hans Ludman, without a miss hit, and Chief Petty Officer V. P. Afanasyev and the Chief Petty Officer P. Afanasyev and Senior Lieutenant V.P. Gumanenko. As a result, 2 destroyers were sunk. Cruiser and destroyer squadron received serious damage. At the same time, we lost 1 boat of Lieutenant N. Kremensky from a direct hit of a shell. Its crew, except for 1 sailor, was rescued by the boat of Lieutenant B. P. Ushchev. Covered by smoke screens, the torpedo boats returned safely to their base. This great victory raised the morale of our garrisons on the islands even higher. In the most difficult days of the September battles near Leningrad for us, healing balm were invariably cheerful reports of Lieutenant General S. I. Kabanov from the peninsula. I. Kabanov from the Hanko Peninsula. The glorious defenders of Red Gangut under the leadership of General S.I. Kabanov and Military Commissar A.L. Raskin fought bravely and assertively. Reports from Hanko were brief, clear. Sergei Ivanovich Kabanov and his closest assistants understood perfectly well the general situation in September, and in their telegrams reported everything that could interest us, but did not ask for any help. The garrison of Hanko kept the enemy in the utmost tension. The small garrison managed not only to defend its positions, but also to considerably expand its operational zone, occupying in July and August 19th surrounding islands. Hanko's small air force supported even the units of the Moonsund archipelago on more than one occasion. In the defence of the base, a great role was played by the headquarters, headed by Captain 2nd Rank Maximov, a knowledgeable and proactive officer. The Khankovs created capacious underground shelters, where people were sheltered during shelling and bombardment, where supplies were stored. There was an underground hospital, and even an underground hangar for airplanes. In the battle for Hanko, a friendly fighting team was forged. I knew well an excellent artilleryman, the hero of many landings on the islands, Capt. M. Granin, the commander of the hunting boats, Captain 2nd Rank M. E. Poligaev, who with his small ships entered the battle against enemy boats, skillfully camouflaged the artillery of the base, and perfectly organized its combat, used Major General of Artillery I. N. Dmitriev. When the fleet left Tallinn, the situation on Hanko became more complicated. Communication with the big land became difficult, supply was disrupted. It was necessary to save shells, food and fuel. In addition, S.I. Kabanov had to take under his guardianship the fortified island Osmosar, located on the southern shore of the Gulf of Finland, to transfer here on boats reinforcements, food and ammunition. The fascists repeatedly tried to break through the defence of Hanko. At first they supposed to capture Hanko by August 1st, then they pushed back this term to September 1st, and then to November 5th. 36 times the enemy rushed to the assault, all in vain. Hanko naval base turned into an impregnable fortress. It diverted significant enemy forces, thus facilitating the situation near Leningrad. This was well understood by the Gangusians, and therefore fought fiercely and selflessly. The feat of the Hankovites entered the heroic annals of our motherland. Decades will pass, wrote the defenders of Moscow to the Gangusians, and mankind will not forget how a handful of brave men, patriots of the Soviet land, not retreating one step before the numerous and heavily armed enemy, under a continuous barrage of artillery and mortar fire, despising death in the name of victory, was an example of unprecedented bravery and heroism. Great honor and immortal glory to you, heroes of Hanko. Our intelligence found out that Hitlerites took their 41st Tank Corps from near Leningrad to the Moscow direction. The commander of the Leningrad front decided to take advantage of this to try to break the blockade of the city. In the area of Nevskaya Dubrovka, it was planned to force the Neva River, capture a bridgehead on the left bank, in order to advance from here to Sinyavino with subsequent access to the station MGA. The task was not easy. The troops had no experience in forcing the water barrier, and the width of the Neva in that place about 600 meters. The enemy occupied a steep, precipitous bank, and our bank was flat, open, all viewed and shot. For the crossing required a large number of means of crossing. We received an urgent task to deliver them to Nevskaya Dubrovka. We must pay tribute to the headquarters of the naval defense of Leningrad and the rear of the fleet. In one day they managed to deliver hundreds of boats and dinghies to the place of crossing. In those days the sea defense of Leningrad was commanded by Rear Admiral F.I. Chelpanov. The Chief of Staff was Rear Admiral V. Atrovsky. They managed to inspire and lead their subordinates to the feat. To Nevskaya Dubrovka stretched a string of trucks with dinghies and boats, formerly belonging to Leningrad rowing clubs and boat stations. Many of them did not reach the crossing, were covered by enemy fire on the shore. But most of them still reached the target. On September 20th, after an artillery preparation, the 115th and 86th Infantry Divisions and the 4th Independent Marine Brigade began to force the Neva River. The fascists fiercely resisted. Their mortars were hitting at point-blank range at the crossing troops. But our troops seized the bridgehead and expanded it to 900 meters in depth and up to 1 kilometer along the front. To develop the offensive infantry needed artillery and tanks. They couldn't be ferried on boats. How can we do it? We formed a special detachment of sailors under the leadership of Captain First Rank F.V. Zozuli, who were instructed to help in the crossing of equipment. 2 days later I went there to see how it was going. Already a few kilometers before the river I had to get out of the car and move in shifts so as not to get under a German mine. The village was destroyed. I found F.V. Zozulia at his CP in a dilapidated house. Fedor Vladimirovich was glad to see me. He told me that our units were firmly entrenched on the other bank. Hitlerites do not manage to throw us into the river. But ours can't move forward without tanks and artillery, and the crossing of heavy vehicles and guns is not yet possible. The enemy is hitting with direct fire. And as if in confirmation of these words, somewhere very close exploded several mines. However, let's go to the shore to the observation point. You will see for yourself, proposed Fyodor Vladimirovich. Running from one ruin to another, we approached the river. I saw the opposite high bank of the Neva. There were piles of dinghies lying under the cliff. Both whole and broken sailors were hiding behind the sandy slopes, waiting for the signal to start their next dangerous voyage. Zozulia showed his hand. Here is our Navy beach. I looked at the shoreline, ploughed by shells. The enemy fired at anyone who showed up here. Yes, it was possible to prepare the crossing only in the dark. The Lenfront headquarters had sent here not only us sailors, but also underwater specialists and even Metrostroy engineers. F.V. Zozulia led me to a large dugout where clouds of tobacco smoke hung and a heated argument could be heard. It was about the same how to transport tanks. Epronovci offered to stretch steel cables and use them to drag the car along the bottom. And the metro construction workers undertook to dig a tunnel under the Neva. When we arrived, they all turned to us almost in unison. "What do the sailors say?" We looked at each other. We ourselves had no clarity yet. We knew one thing: neither the cables thrown across the Neva, nor the tunnel under the river we cannot do. Zozulia spoke with conviction. Tanks can be transported only on pontoons or on large rafts. Someone in the depths of the dugout objected. "We've already tried it. It doesn't work." But what could be offered, having nothing at hand but dinghies and boats? Captain First Rank Zozulia and his detachment have already done a lot. Sailors organized the transfer of reserves to the bridgehead and the removal of wounded from the left bank. The crossing worked, despite the furious enemy fire. Sailors, standing waist-deep in cold water, helped under fire to quickly load dinghies and plashkovits, ferried them to the left bank. Calm, precise work of sailors raised the morale of soldiers, convinced them that the patch is constantly connected with the rear. On the way back, already in the car, I thought, where else can we get watercraft with reliable motors and where to get replenishment for our crossing? Unfortunately, we did not have enough forces to develop the offensive from the occupied bridgehead. However, the battles at Nevskaya Dubrovka were of great importance. They showed that we still had some powder in our powders. The fascists suffered huge losses. They realized that neither here nor on other parts of the front near Leningrad they will not rest. The heroic deeds of our paratroopers will always remember the sandy shores of Nevskaya Dubrovka. Late in the evening by boat we were returning to Kronstadt. In peacetime I loved quiet evenings and the sleeping surface of the bay. Glowing buoys winked around. The white and red lights of Kronstadt lighthouses shone ahead. Behind the stern was reflected in the water bright electric light of Leningrad. It was very different now. The impenetrable darkness hid Leningrad. Above the southern shore, in the areas of Strelna and Peterhof, fires were blazing. Sharp as a sword, the beams of German searchlights were scouring the water. Somewhere ahead lurked Kronstadt. Only by the flashes of heavy guns could be judged about the proximity of our fortress. I was summoned to the Smolny. In the shelter on the Leningradskaya wharf of Kronstadt we waited for a long time when the artillery bombardment would end. But the Germans stubbornly beat on the eastern roadstead, where there were several warships. Our patience ran out, and we on a boat at full speed jumped out from behind the burned pier. The snow-white staff boat, of course, immediately attracted the attention of the enemy. A few splashes surged off the starboard side. It's under flight. We turned to the north, and at 20 knots speed ran away from the firing zone. Everything is familiar to me in the Neva Bay. Even as a boy I went on a dinghy all over the Markizova puddle. The foreman of the boat asked which way we would go. The sea channel and the ship's fairway are under fire. "Nothing," I reassured him and stood next to him at the helm. "Take another left." We were running along the northern shore of the Neva Bay. On the right, on the shore of Peterhof, the Grand Palace was burning. Where Alexandria used to be, only a dilapidated tower now stood. It was hard to believe that the Germans were in Peterhof and Strelna. We entered the Neva by the Petrovsky Fairway. I had not been in Leningrad for about a month, but how much had changed in that time? It was hard to look at my hometown, where I was born and grew up. The streets smelled of smoke. People were concentrating on dismantling the ruins of houses and removing the victims of the recent raid. Particularly tragic impression was left by the houses where only one wall had collapsed, and on all floors, as if for show, there was furniture, pianos in the rooms, shrunken paintings hanging, and the remains of a chandelier swinging on a wire. And in one apartment a murdered woman lay on the carpet, hanging as if over the abyss. Moisaev, the chauffeur, a young sailor, scowled angrily and muttered incessantly. "Bastards. Bastards. Damn bandits." In Smolny I was taken to a Zhdanov, secretary of the Central Committee of the party, a member of the Military Council of the Front. Alexandrovich said, "We decided to create the Leningrad Naval Base, which should organize the sea defense of the city, including in winter on the ice of the Gulf of Finland. What do you think if we appoint you commander of this base? You will also be the deputy on the sea part of the commander of the internal defense of the city. I answered that Leningrad is my homeland and I consider it a great honor to defend it at any post. Well, that's fine. The next day I said goodbye to my comrades in arms and left for Leningrad. The morning of October 1st dawned, and I was already on Vasilievsky Island. With excitement I entered the building of the Naval Academy, which was very familiar to me. This is now the headquarters of the Naval Defense of Leningrad. Almost 10 years have passed since I graduated from this oldest educational institution of the Russian Navy. I remember the shine of copper on the massive heavy doors, the snow-white marble staircase with the traditional red carpet, and at the entrance the invariable old doorman Yurovich, who began his sailor service on sailing ships. In the academy lobby one could meet then old Baltic sailors K. I, Dushanov, N.A. Bologov, S.P. Stavitsky, N.B. Pavlovich and other flagmen of the Civil War era who became venerable scientists and naval leaders. Now the colours have faded. The lobby became quiet and empty. An unfamiliar sailor with a machine gun on his chest carefully checked my documents at the door. I walk down the deserted stairs and corridors. Classrooms are open, bookcases are unlocked, everything valuable from them has been taken out long ago. The large windows are bricked up everywhere, and the once bright high classrooms now seem low and gloomy. I met Sailor Yurovich, our old janitor, in one of the corridors. He was sweeping the classroom in a worn-out navy coat, muttering something complacently to himself. We met like good acquaintances and talked about military affairs. The old man could hardly remember me, but when I mentioned the year of my graduation from the academy, he smiled amiably and slowly, as if really remembering, replied in a quiet, thin voice. And how, my dear fellow, I remember you. You graduated from the academy at… And then Yurovich called the name of the former head of the academy at that time. The old sailor was already 93 years old, but he had not left his labour post for a long time and tragically died shortly after the academy celebrated its centennial anniversary. The Naval Defence Headquarters was located in the basement of the academy. Here at the control room were operational duty and management of artillery of the fleet and coastal defence. In an uncomfortable narrow room overlooking the courtyard, I was cordially met by my predecessor F.I. Chelpanov, who had already received a new appointment. Waiting for you. Let's not waste time. And immediately getting down to business, Rear Admiral stepped to a small safe, took out and put on the table several folders with operational documents. Since my cadet years, I know Fedor Ivanovich. Chelpanov was known in the Navy as one of the best artillerymen. He was small in stature, heavy, with a round, almost naked haircut head, with sly little eyes. Like a ball, he rolled over on his short legs. However, he did everything in no hurry, and did not fuss even under the enemy's fire. Our detailed conversation about the situation in the operational zone of the new naval base, which was still being formed, lasted until evening. It was interrupted by a telephone call. Commander of the Sea Defence urgently summoned to the front headquarters. Chelpanov replied that he was giving up his business. I understood that in his mind he is already far outside of Leningrad, in another theatre of war, and he clearly does not want to go to headquarters. You go, he said. Take with you Chief of Staff Rear Admiral Petrovsky. He is aware of all matters. There was no time to think. It was good that we also knew Vladimir Alexandrovich Petrovsky from our cadet years. He is an educated and neat officer. Before the war he was also engaged in literature at his leisure. He signed his works about the sea and sailors with the pseudonym Vladimir Necht. He made an excellent chief of staff. Together with him we went to Smolny. The head of the operational department of the front headquarters, General Dmitry Nikolaevich Gusev, briefly familiarized us with the situation. After the breakthrough of the Nazis to the Gulf of Finland in the area of Strelna, Peterhof front near Leningrad temporarily stabilized. It was necessary to eliminate this breakthrough by a counter-offensive of our armies into the flanks of the enemy. According to the plan of the front commander, the 42nd Army was to advance from Leningrad to Strelna and the 8th Army to Peterhof from Oranienbaum. The front commander ordered tomorrow, October 2nd, at dawn to land a landing force to support the 42nd Army. One company of the 6th Separate Brigade of Marines should be landed here. And with these words the general pointed with a pencil a point on a large map lying on the table. We leaned over with Petrovsky and looked at each other in surprise. The point of the intended landing, a fisherman's cottage, east of the typewriter factory, was only a few kilometers from the front line. In this place, of course, we had to expect the location of the Nazi tactical reserves of the front. A number of questions immediately arose before us, but we did not have time to ask them. We were summoned to the front commander. Army General G. K. Zhukov met us. K. Zhukov met us with restraint and sternly. He looked at me with tired eyes and dryly asked, "Cases and duties have not yet taken?" "No." "Well, good, you will have time to take, and now get down to business." Going to the map. Zhukov showed us the place of landing. "A company of sailors is to land here to meet the 42nd Army. Is that clear? Don't invent any landing operations. Act quickly and secretly. Move the company, that's all. Do you know the place?" "Yes, I do." "Why are you so sure?" "You have not been there." The commander was surprised. "This is my homeland. On the southern shore of the bay, I know every stone." Zhukov broke away from the map, looked at me point blank, was silent, and then added, "The task of the landing force will set you the commander of the 42nd Army. Although, do not start any landing. Move me a company, and that's all." The conversation was over. We perfectly understood what a huge responsibility for the fate of Leningrad lies on the shoulders of this man. All the more wanted to clarify all the details of the operation. But Zhukov was already busy with other things. I will not describe this landing. I will only say we did everything to deliver and land the Marines at the appointed point and at the appointed time without losses. The commander of the landing, Captain Lieutenant Shavtsov, and military commander Senior Political Officer Kizelev coped with their work perfectly. At the head of all the ships of the detachment was Lieutenant Commander Krylov. Many boat commanders were our Leningrad yachtsmen who knew the area very well. With the landing clearly interacted with the cover ships. A special detachment of ships to the west of the landing site carried out demonstrative actions to distract the attention of the enemy. The landing party safely landed on the shore, went deep into enemy territory. But that was the end of its success. For a long time we knew nothing about the further actions of the detachment, as we could not get in touch with it. In the same haste, without any preparation, we landed 4 more landings on the order of the front commander, 1 in Peterhof, 3 in the Strelna area. Sailors and NKVD troops took part in them. Soldiers, sailors, and officers heroically carried out the combat order and did everything that was in their power, and it was not their fault that they did not reach the big goal. Of course, the landings in the area of Peterhof and Strelna were important. Army General I. Fedyuninsky, who at that time commanded the 42nd Army, in his book Raised on Alert, writes the landings, although they could not fully fulfill their tasks because we failed to connect with them, still inflicted significant losses on the enemy. The Nazis were forced to begin to create an anti-landing defense of the coast. In Strelna they built pillboxes and bunkers on the shore. On an even larger scale they built defensive structures in Peterhof Park. Marley Alley was turning into a deep anti-tank ditch. On the site against the Montplaisir Palace, guns were installed. On the bank were created rubble, wire barriers. In the highland part of the park were placed Hitlerite striking units, ready to rush to the area of possible landing. They were taken from the front from near Leningrad. To do so forced the enemy our Baltic paratroops in October. All this played a role in the defense of the city, and yet we understood with a good organization of the case paratroopers would have been able to do much more at much lower losses. In October 1941, the blockade was not so acutely felt in Leningrad. The streetcars were running, the light was on in the apartments, telephones were working. In the streets was a lot of people, frantically rushing to different ends of the city. In the evenings worked some movie theatres. Always crowded was in the musical comedy. At evening tea, though already in a bite, received friends, shared the news. Even the third reduction of food standards on October 1st was met without much alarm. Still, workers and engineers and technicians were given 400 grams of bread in addition to other products. Employees, dependents and children 250 grams. There were a lot of children on the streets. In the yards they were playing war. Of course, almost daily shelling and bombing disrupted the rhythm of life in the city. But the inhabitants of Leningrad disciplined, without panic, met all the requirements of air defense. More and more often fire departments swept through the city. In October, according to some data, there were more than 700 fires from incendiary bombs. In October, the fascists dropped about 61,000 high-explosive bombs of different caliber on Leningrad, twice as much as in September. To this, we should add 7,500 shells. The blockade was talked about as something temporary, believing that it was about to be broken through. Many of my acquaintances asked me quite calmly, "Tell me, please, Yuri Alexandrovich, when is the blockade supposed to be broken through?" It was said as if it was an event provided for by a precise schedule. Usually this is how one asks about the time of arrival of the Red Arrow Express to Leningrad. We, of course, supported these cheerful moods of our dear Leningraders in every possible way. Certainly, I answered everyone, the blockade will be broken. And soon. Only a few days passed after the landing of the last landing force in the area of Peterhof. Late in the evening of October 12th, in the headquarters of the base unexpectedly arrived at the Fleet Commander Vice Admiral V.F. Tributes. "We will break the blockade, this time in the eastern part of the front," he announced to us. This message excited all of us. In the headquarters was urgently summoned a number of flag officers and top officers of the fleet. Komflot informed us that Stavka had instructed the commander of the Len front to carry out an operation on the blockade of Leningrad by a strike on the Sinievinsk-Schlisselburg bulge. The strike was to be carried out by the troops of the Len front and at the same time from the outside by the units of the 54th Army. In case of a favourable outcome of the operation, the troops of the 55th and 54th Armies reach the MGA station and, having joined forces, break the blockade ring. At the same time begins the offensive and the Neva task force from Nevskaya Dubrovka. Then the commander said that in connection with this operation the fleet should by the end of October 18th to transfer from Oranienbaum to Leningrad 191st Infantry Division. The crossing of several thousand soldiers and about 40 guns across the bay under continuous enemy fire presented considerable difficulties. Day after day the fascists intensively shelled the harbours of Oranienbaum, although there were no transports there yet. The whole way from Oranienbaum to Leningrad was visualized by their artillery observers. Deep-sea ships could only go through the sea canal. If even one transport sank here, all transportation would be interrupted for a long time. So all attention should be paid to camouflage transports and disorientation of the enemy. It was decided to send the first transports from Oranienbaum with various household goods and small military teams, so that these transports did not differ from the usual ones in that autumn. The division units will be transported only in the dark time by detachments of 2-3 small and medium-sized ships, which could leave the canal by their draft and, if necessary, evade the enemy's artillery fire. In addition, in order to reduce the draught of the transports, they should have been loaded to no more than a quarter of their carrying capacity. The formation of detachments and their departure from Leningrad was entrusted to the headquarters of the Leningrad Naval Base. We were also responsible for mine and air defense of these ships in their operational zone. It was necessary to maximize our patrols. All patrol boats and minesweepers of the base water area protection took position in the Nevskaya Bay to protect the fairways from mines and to cover the transports with smoke screen. In the area of Peterhof and Strelna for the time of the passage of ships with troops went out canal boat and minesweeper to immediately destroy artillery fire searchlights of the enemy in their attempt to illuminate our ships. To combat German artillery shelling the canal, 4 batteries were specially allocated in Kronstadt, and the Leningrad Naval Base allocated 6 railroad batteries in the area of the trade port for the same purpose. From the air transportation was covered by fighters of the 61st Aviation Brigade of the fleet. It was also decided not to keep any transports on the roadstead in Kronstadt, and especially in the harbours of Oranienbaum, during daylight hours. In Leningrad, the transports were dispersed over the large water area of the trade port and along the Neva. With the onset of darkness, they had to quickly enter the port of Oranienbaum, take on board without delay the army units assigned for transportation, and just as quickly leave for Leningrad. This required precise, to the minute, coordination of the time of arrival of the division units and ships in the port. The slightest inconsistency in the movement could disrupt the entire transportation and, even worse, decipher the enemy Ardlan. I gathered the captains of transports warned them. If you delay in the port until dawn, disaster is imminent. All day October 15th, the fascists again fiercely shelled Oranienbaum port. There were no ships in it, of course. At night, the first 3 transports entered there. The captains kept their word. They dashingly moored. Quickly taking the troops with equipment and weapons, the detachment immediately went to sea. Just as accurately on schedule came and the second detachment of ships. During the dark time of the day, they managed to make 2-3 trips. Watch boats of the Leningrad naval base reliably smogged the area of the canal between Peterhof and Strelna. All these nights, both in Kronstadt at the fleet headquarters and in Leningrad, we were at command posts and literally hung on the wires, informing each other about the movement of transports with troops. The patrol boats were constantly reporting on the passage of transports through the control boundaries, but it seemed to us that they were doing it very slowly. Minutes seemed like hours, and hours seemed like an eternity. I had just put down the telephone receiver, and the call came again. I recognized the calm voice of Rear Admiral Wyeth Rawle, who accepted from me the position of Chief of Staff of the fleet. Yuri Alexandrovich. So where is the detachment? Why is there no report on the passage of the meridian of Kamenia Bank? What could I answer? We can't contact by radio. Hitlerites will immediately detect the transport's radios. We call by phone to our observation post in the head of the dike of the sea canal. The answer is short. Nothing can be seen, no shooting. The enemy does not shine. I hesitantly reported to the fleet headquarters in Kronstadt. Apparently, everything is all right. The ships are coming. And finally, as if a mountain fell off my shoulders, the telephonist on duty shouted, "The post reports I see a self-propelled barge." Everyone sighs with relief. It turned out that the boats had very successfully put a dense smoke screen that night. Driven by a weak tailwind, it covered the ships with an impenetrable wall. Even our patrol boats could not see them. The enemy never detected our transports. They were successful and were completed on October 18th. The Leningrad front received reinforcements for the planned operation at the exact appointed time. In parallel with the transportation of troops from Oranienbaum, the Leningrad naval base was solving another, no less important task. It was necessary to considerably strengthen people, artillery and tanks of the Neva task force, which should attack from the patch near Nevskaya Dubrovka on the left bank of the Neva. It was about the urgent crossing of the Neva. 16,000 soldiers, more than 100 guns and several dozen tanks. We still in September had some experience of such a transfer of troops, knew all its difficulties. We could not count on the secrecy of our actions. The enemy visually observed all our movements on the right, lower bank of the river. His artillery had a good aim. Mortars simply did not give an opportunity to appear from the trenches. For the crossing of troops across the Neva required a lot of dinghies and boats. Where to get them? The dinghies that we collected in September, by that time almost all of them were out of order. We started looking for pleasure boats in the city again. The militia came to our aid, knowing very well at which boat stations we could still find something. They picked up under the broom both in Kronstadt and on the ships. Gathering of boats and their further direction to the place of crossing was entrusted to the staff of protection of the water area of the base. Captain of the 3rd rank Bogdanovich, an officer with a lively mind and outstanding organizational skills, commanded this diverse and restless group. When after all our Strelinsky landings I began to find out from him how many serviceable boats were left for the planned crossing, Bogdanovich only asked, "How many are needed? And by what date?" "But you won't have even a dozen. They are all broken and need repair." "Let's call the chiefs of boats and motorists. We'll try to do something." The officer knew his men believed in their strength. On Krestovsky, against the arrow of Alagin Island. Our flotilla, I did not expect to keep more than a day. After all, a few bombs would be enough, and the whole flotilla would turn into burnt pokers. With my fears, however, did not agree neither Major Nolnik, the head of the staff post of the MPEI, nor Captain Second Rank Soratinsky, the head of the operational department of the staff. We analysed all the reports of the city's air defence for the last few days, the lively and quick-witted Major reported to me, and came to a certain conclusion. The Major stopped and looked at Soratinsky, as if looking for his support, and the latter confidently continued. Facts and figures have led us to the conclusion, Comrade Admiral, that the Germans now need aviation, especially at the front here, near Leningrad, and on the Moscow direction. Besides, the raids on Leningrad cost them very dearly. In September, only from the fire of anti-aircraft gunners, they lost more than 130 bombers. Now the fascists changed the tactics of their airstrikes. They began to attack the city mainly at night, in separate groups of 15-20 airplanes, with small intervals in time. The main goal of the enemy is to burn the city. It is unlikely, therefore, that he would fly at night to the deserted Krestovsky Island. For September, 16,000 incendiaries were dropped on Leningrad, and for half of October much more during the day the enemy was making barrage artillery raids on some parts of the city. The fire was conducted at the intersections of large streets with saturated streetcar traffic, and even during the rush hours when city residents were going to or returning from work. The calculation was clear during the day to destroy the city and destroy the population with shells, and at night to give them neither sleep nor rest. This exhausted the people. Although the arguments of the Air Defence Headquarters were confirmed by life itself, by the enemy's behaviour, still we were very worried about the fate of our crossing means. Every day someone from the command visited the place of gathering all the boats. I remember I went to the yacht club Vodnik on Krestovsky Island, where there was a base of protection of the water district. I looked at the river and was amazed. The surface of the water is almost invisible. A kind of rafts made of dinghies covered the river. It seemed that it was possible to run across to the other side of the Neva. I was met by the commander of the coastal base, military engineer of the second rank Yusufovich. I asked him, "And if suddenly the fall Zuid West will not place your flotilla all over the Neva?" "It is absolutely excluded. We used a special mooring system." Yusufovich was an associate professor at the Naval Academy. He had a degree of candidate of technical sciences. The war forced him to postpone temporarily his scientific work, and who would have thought that a young growing scientist would turn out to be a good host and organizer of sailors' everyday life during the hardest days of the blockade of Leningrad? The sailors' food, their life and leisure time at the coastal base of Ovyar were organized in those difficult conditions better than in many other formations. We built an excellent bathhouse there by our own efforts. It was a great thing for the crew of the boat, who had been on patrol in a storm and in the rain for several days, to wash in a hot bath. A special group of sailors was created to service the boats and to act on the crossing itself. It consisted mainly of sailors of bosun's commands, who knew the dinghy business and had excellent sea training. Hundreds of dinghies from Krestovsky Island had to be delivered by trucks to the area of Nevskaya Dubrovka. The head of the rear of the fleet, General M.I. Moskalenko immediately provided us with all his trucks and asked for dozens of cars from the rear of the front. The movement of trucks carrying dinghies and boats had to be watched all the time. In October the snow had already fallen and melted more than once. Some of the roads outside the city were in bad condition. Most of all we were afraid of traffic jams on the roads, especially when the city and suburbs were shelled. I remember that General Moskalenko, and I caught up with a large column of vehicles somewhere in the woods behind Rozhevka. There was noise, swearing on the road, but it was hard to get any results. We found the column commander. M.I. Moskalenko began to scold the young commander for the fact that he was stuck on the road in a place that had already been shelled by the enemy more than once. "Understand, you will be left without cars. I have no tires. Who will repair you here? Turn off into the woods quickly." In my turn, I was telling some bosun that you can't stand on the road during daylight hours. You'll lose all the dinghies, we have no more. At that moment an airplane passed over us, apparently a scout. Somewhere very close to us anti-aircraft guns were fiercely snapping at us. Soon the shelling of the area began. The enemy must have learned about the mass swimming of boats through the city. However, the column reached the place of unloading relatively safely, only lightly wounded by shrapnel 2 sailors, and broke several dinghies. The wounded sailors did not want to leave the column for anything. No way. Their hands are safe, their legs too, and the flesh will grow over. They answered us in chorus. In the evening I heard the voices of these glorious Ukrainians again, behind the wall of a small hut, where the headquarters of the naval detachment was located at the crossing. A sailor was being bandaged, and he, choking with delight, told the paramedic. That was fun. A general and an admiral jumped on our column. The general said, "Save the cars, I won't give you any others." And the admiral snapped at the bosun, "Take care," he says, "of the boats, we have no others." That's how to understand the bosses. But in general, we made it. Not all, of course, the columns managed to get safely to the place of unloading. On October 17th and 18th, the enemy shelled the roads leading to the crossing particularly hard and repeatedly. We began to suffer significant losses both in men and in watercraft, but still in the forests near the river soon grew whole stacks of dinghies stacked one on top of the other. The necessary stock of watercraft had been built up. We had one more important task to support by fire the offensive of our troops. For this purpose, the Leningrad Naval Base organized a special artillery group. It included 14 stationary and 6 railroad batteries, 4 gunboats and 5 destroyers. All of them took their firing positions also by the end of October 15th. Rear Admiral I. Gren was joyful. His command post was still located together with our headquarters, and we met there every day to solve all current issues. Once I went to his command post, I see him sitting and calculating something. "What do you think, Admiral?" "What can I count? Of course, shells how much is needed and how much is left. After all, they'll be firing almost 90 naval guns up to 180 mm caliber. This is no joke." And smiling slyly, Gren added, "Keep in mind, this is about 30% of all the artillery of the front assigned to the operation. The fascists will be hot." Fleet commander allocated from the fleet aviation fighters to cover the ships in firing positions. Strike Fleet Aviation was to operate in conjunction with the army. Ladoga Military Flotilla also received a task to support the advancing units of the 54th Army along the lake shore with its fire. The operation to break the blockade was not openly talked about. It was a secret, known only to the leadership of the fleet. But everyone understood something big was being prepared. Meanwhile, our ships in Leningrad and Kronstadt were daily firing at the enemy, at his batteries and railroad hubs. The ships were echoed by the batteries. The fire, of course, was conducted according to the plan, and within the limits of shells strictly allocated by the limit. However, the daily consumption of ammunition was very high. On average per day we spent more than 600 shells of large caliber. The flagship artilleryman of the base, Captain 2nd Rank Fedosov, knew and loved his work. His reports could always be trusted. More than once in those days he anxiously informed me about the large consumption of shells, asked to clarify the size of our ammunition from the chief of the rear of the fleet. With this question I came a day or two before the operation to General M.I. Moskalenko. The rear department was then located in an old naval building on the Krusenstern Canal, almost next to the Admiralty shipyard. From a military point of view, the neighborhood was not a pleasant one. I involuntarily remembered a joke of young commanders, my friends from the Black Sea cruiser Chervona Ukraina, usually at evening tea in the wardroom, in the presence of senior artilleryman A. Grigoriev, gloomily thinking about something. One of them suddenly asked me in the most innocent and serious tone, "Navigator, I want to watch the shooting tomorrow. Where, in your opinion, is the best place for me to set up?" I answered in the same tone. Of course, the safest place on the artillery shield, in the worst case a little splashing, and that's all. It's very difficult to hit the shield. The senior artilleryman would grab his glass with tea and run away to his cabin. We often recalled this well-known joke in the fleets during the blockade. The fascists were always aiming at Smolny and the NKVD house on Litiny Prospect, and perhaps not a single bomb fell even close to them. And how much the enemy shot at the Admiralty plant. And yet it survived. Small damages do not count. So it turned out that on the shield, that is, on the target, to sit safer than away from it. So in the old fleet house on the territory of New Holland General M. I. Moskalenko occupied a not very large dark office. I reported why I had come. There are enough shells for your troops, the general said good-naturedly. But I'm concerned about how and where the ammunition is dispersed. It wouldn't happen like with the Badeyev warehouses. Alexei Mikhailovich turned to Lieutenant Colonel Moskalenko. Give again your scheme of ammunition dispersal. Lieutenant Colonel Bereskin unfolded in front of us on the table a small scheme of the location of their objects. For many years he was the head of the well-known in the Baltic artillery arsenal, the main storage of naval ammunition. It was a whole town with many warehouses, workshops, with its own railroad access roads. When the front unexpectedly for all of us approached the area of the arsenal, Bereskin quickly organized the evacuation of all ammunition in the area of Leningrad. However, the fascists in September came very close to the city, and the ammunition was again threatened. Day and night, often under fire, the work in the woods and sand pits to create new temporary sites for storing not only artillery shells, but also mines and bombs for aviation. The ammunition was safely camouflaged and concealed from any unauthorized observation. After the arrival of the fleet from Tallinn in 1 month were built to each site with ammunition access roads, in some places even railroad lines. I listened attentively to the explanations of A. Bereskin and was amazed how in a matter of days it was possible to carry out such a large work, so important for the combat readiness of the fleet. Did all commanders of submarines and surface ships know who hid torpedoes, depth bombs, mines and shells from Nazi bombs and shelling? It is a pity that so little was said about these people, and even less was written about them. Moskalenko offered me to go with him to the main sites where ammunition was stored. We drove along some very confusing forest roads. Here we turned behind a forest, and on a railroad track in a large quarry saw the original railroad train artillery workshop of the rear. There were both teplushki and platforms and class wagons. In the cars and on the platforms stood machine tools. There were also devices for melting explosives from old and unnecessary shells and mines. The melted explosives were immediately filled with new ammunition. There were several such workshops on wheels in the fleet rear. Modestly and vigorously worked on the creation of these workshops and sheltered sites, the head of the artillery department of the rear, Captain First Rank S. P. Prokopnov, a man who was in love with his profession. And Captain Third Rank St. Barishpolitz was just as selflessly engaged in the preparation and repair of torpedoes, so necessary for submarines, torpedo boats and aviation. His efforts expanded the workshops of the rowing port. Here, during the hardest days of the blockade, the work did not stop. St. Barishpolitz and his subordinates managed to provide torpedoes for all the needs of the fleet and our aviation. With a good feeling and cheerful mood, I returned from this trip. Much work was done to establish our communications radio, telegraph and telephone. Flagship communications base engineer Captain 2 Rank Schwarzberg also came to us from science and brilliantly justified both the title of scientist and the title of communist. He perfectly organized a complex multi-channel communication. Quickly understanding the situation, Schwarzberg worked independently without waiting for instructions. His report was always short: the connection has been checked and is functioning properly. And so it was. So everything was ready. All details have been clarified with the commanders of batteries and ships, waiting for the signal. However, in war often happens quite different from what we want and as planned. On October 17th, transportation of divisions from Oranienbaum was in full swing. With the onset of darkness, we had to send the last group of ships for the troops. I call in Kronstadt to the Chief of Staff of the Fleet Rear Admiral Jef Rawl. I report on the measures taken to ensure and cover the transition of transports. I end my report with the usual question in those days. How are things with you? And suddenly I get an answer. not good at our neighbour. The operation has not yet begun, and already something happened, apparently serious. During the night we learned that the enemy had preempted us. On November 16th, his 39th Army Corps suddenly began an offensive from the area of Gruzino to Tikvin. From the area of Kurishi began the offensive and the 1st Army Corps of the Germans. Having created a significant superiority of forces, especially in tanks and artillery, by October 20th they broke through the defence front of our 4th Army and launched an offensive on Tikvin and Volkhov in order to connect on the Svia River with the Finnish army and to create a second ring of encirclement of Leningrad. The only railroad that connected us with the whole country was cut. In these difficult conditions, the troops of the Leningrad front began the operation to break the blockade on October 20th, but the factor of surprise was already lost. The enemy apparently foresaw the possibility of our offensive. He unleashed a downpour of artillery and mortar fire on our units. Hardly had we begun to cross the Neva, as the entire area of the concentration of boats and boats was subjected to fire from cannons and mortars. With great difficulty we made our way with Commissar A. Matushkin to the NP of the commander of the naval detachment. Infantry units approaching the crossing suffered losses on the open ground. Just launched dozens of dinghies were at once turned into splinters. Our sailors showed exceptional heroism. The wounded were carried away behind the hillside, and others ran out to replace them, quickly dragging serviceable sixes into the water, and so several times. A completely broken dinghy came ashore. The boatswain, judging by his age, an enlisted man came to the yawl, took off the remaining rudder, took away the bows, cut off the fore and aft Fellini with an axe, and carried it all steadily somewhere behind the hill, to a shelter. Everything will come in handy in the boatswain's household. Good old Navy school. How much power and majesty was in the calm movements and gait of this great man. A new battalion is approaching the shore. The soldiers nimbly get into the boats, sailors, standing waist deep, chest deep in the icy water, plant soldiers, joking with them, pushing the boats away from the shore. And on the opposite high shore they are met by another group of sailors, helping the soldiers to quickly disembark, unload machine guns and mortars. All this is done without fuss, skillfully. I see a boat, overcoming the strong current of the Neva, dragging a few of our six with fighters. But a moment, an explosion, flames, muffled, quickly subsiding screams and groans. Planks float, a few soldiers hold on to them. They are carried by the current to our shore. And from the sandy beach torn up by shells, more and more boats are falling off. The movement on the river does not stop for a minute. Dark time was not enough. We had to work in the daytime. The deadline for concentration of troops on the left bank was tight. For the crossing of light guns, our skillful matros quickly created rafts from dinghies. Special rafts for tanks were also built, and all this under incessant enemy fire. Our shells were whistling over our heads. It was the fleet batteries were covering the crossing and the advance of our troops. By evening, not only the ships and batteries of the base, allocated for this purpose according to the plan, were firing. By order of the commander of the fleet, the attack was supported by ships of the squadron. Fired battleships, cruisers, destroyers, in short, the entire fleet. It seemed that against such a force nothing could resist. The rumble of cannonade kept the spirit of the fighters at the crossing. The sailors marvelled our krauts are beating the krauts so well, so them. Fierce fighting on the Neva continued from October 20th to 24. The fleet fired more than 24,000 shells of various calibers at the enemy only for these 4 days. And yet the Leningrad front did not achieve the expected success with this operation. The units allocated to participate in it suffered significant losses in the previous battles, and fresh divisions, which could strengthen the strike group, there was no. The unsuccessful outcome of the operation affected the haste with which it was prepared. The enemy repulsed our offensive. But its importance was great. We made Hitler's command realize that Leningrad is not going to reconcile with the position of a blockaded fortress. The idea of a breakthrough is alive, and it will live in the heart of every defender of the city. It didn't work today, it will work tomorrow. That's what each of us thought. Transportation of troops to the left bank to strengthen and fortify our patch continued until the freezing of the Neva. More than half of our landing fleet was destroyed and burned. In November, sailors together with sappers laid 3 ice roads across the Neva. Through the river, 18 cables were wound up, logs were laid on them. It used to happen that no sooner such road would freeze solidly than the artillery fire would break everything, and the work would start again. Fleet engineers A.N. Kuzmin and V. Grecony showed themselves perfectly in the hard work of organizing the ice crossing. Grecony. In total, more than 17,000 soldiers, 49 tanks, and 139 guns were ferried by boats and on the ice. Pyatak on the left bank thus received a significant reinforcement. With the freezing of the Neva, our naval detachment was disbanded. The Leningrad front in the battles of October 20th to 24th not only improved its positions, but, most importantly, constrained by its active actions large enemy forces, thus alleviating the situation in Moscow, under which the greatest battle was already heating up. Since the operation on the left bank of the Neva did not give the expected results, the enemy could transfer part of his forces to deepen the breakthrough to Tikhvin and Volkhov. Urgent measures were needed to counteract the German offensive. The troops defending Leningrad also required replenishment. In this regard, the Stavka recognized the need to concentrate the forces of the Leningrad front in decisive directions. In the implementation of this plan, the Baltic Fleet played an important role. It was decided to immediately move the entire 8th Army from the Iranian bomb patch to Leningrad, replacing it with fleet units from the islands. For this purpose, the Stavka ordered to urgently remove all our units from the islands of the Bieka archipelago, Gobland and Tutors. At the disposal of the fleet remained only the island of Seskar with a small garrison. On the Iranian bomb patch was created Primorskaya operational group of army and navy units. To strengthen the Leningrad front, the Stavka ordered to evacuate all troops from the Hanko Peninsula. Its defence after our abandonment of the Moonsund Islands on October 22nd was complicated in all respects and lost its operational expediency. In winter, when the whole area was frozen, all communication with the peninsula would be interrupted. The defenders of Hanko, and first of all their leader, General S.I. Kabanov, did not think about evacuation. Summoned to Leningrad, the Chief of Staff of the base, Captain 2nd Rank P.G. Maximov, was preparing to report on the winter defence, but not about the evacuation plan. All the many thousands of troops and equipment the fleet had to transport in the most urgent order and in the full sense of the word under the nose of the enemy. Naturally, nights were not enough. It was necessary to provide daytime transportation as well. The Hanko-Kronstadt communication was still clogged with mines and was under the control of fascist aviation. The Ladoga military flotilla had no less important and responsible task. It was ordered to urgently transport across the lake from Osinovets to Novaya Ladoga the 44th and 191st Infantry Divisions and the 6th Separate Brigade of Marines to strengthen the troops in the Volkhov direction. The situation there was very difficult. As luck would have it, there was a continuous storm on Ladoga during those days. On October 23rd, 6 barges with food for Leningrad sank. The fascist aviation continuously hovered over the lake communication, bombed our ships. And yet the flotilla, under the cover of fighter aviation, transported all the troops without losses. The 6th Marine Brigade entered the battle at the Volkhov, and with its heroic actions together with the army units defended it in the most critical hours of defence. The flotilla was commanded by a talented sailor captain 1st Rank V.F. S. Cherokov. In difficult conditions, he brilliantly coped with the task. By the same decision of the Stavka, most of the warships were ordered to be relocated from Kronstadt to Leningrad, where the air defence was stronger and where it was easier to disperse the ships along the Neva than in Kronstadt harbours. This, of course, in many ways strengthened the defence of the city. It was decided to move the fleet headquarters to Leningrad. To solve all organisational issues in Leningrad arrived in the Chief of Staff of the Fleet, Rear Admiral Y.F. Roll. Under his leadership, we made a new disposition of ships in the Neva and all the plans for transportation of troops. And what about Gogland? This is the front line of Kronstadt, I asked the Chief of Staff. After all, we desperately need it to ensure the exit of submarines into the sea. Finally, it is necessary to cover the eastern part of the Gulf of Finland, where the flanks of our armies are located. The official position of the Chief of Staff of the Fleet, and the situation did not allow him to enter into a discussion with me on this subject. because the order to abandon Gogland had already been given. However, I realized from Rawls' tone that he agreed with me. Later I learned that Comflot was of the same opinion and reported to the Military Council of the Front our considerations. In the Stavka directive it was said about the transportation of troops from Hanko and the islands, but it was not specified from which islands. The headquarters of the Len Front apparently did not want to redraft and clarify it, having decided that it was about all the islands of the Gulf of Finland. The decision of Stavka to evacuate Gogland, of course, was wrong. We left the island prematurely, without pressure from the enemy. Already in winter, in December, we had to take it back, but we could not hold it, then we did not have enough forces. By spring Gogland was again occupied by the enemy, but already with a fight. At the very last moment, when the units defending Levensari were ready to load on transports, the Comflot managed to persuade the High Command to leave at least this island for us. It was needed to organize the withdrawal of submarines to the sea and to meet them on their return. The transfer of troops of the 8th Army from Oranienbaum on large transports, only through the sea canal, and only at night, did not suit us. We risked not to meet the allotted time. Therefore, for transportation by small-sized ships outside the sea canal were reported in the northern part of the Neva Bay special fairways, guarded around the clock by patrol boats. Among the allocated shallow sitting ships were net barriers, hydrographic vessels, cargo schooners, self-propelled barges, and 30 tugs with barges. For night passages along the sea canal were used mainly 16 large transports. And here in the Marquis Puddle began the most intensive movement along the channel and on the newly laid parallel fairways. The enemy, of course, noticed this and pulled up artillery in the area of Strilna, Peterhof. Shelling of the sea canal increased significantly. The Germans opened fire immediately when any tugboat appeared from behind the dam. Our smoke screens also became less effective. The Nazi artillerymen shot at the line of the sea canal. Sitting in Peterhof and Strilna, they watched all our movements and could have caused us great trouble if not for our artillery. In addition to the ships going by sea, the enemy was intensively shelling Kronstadt, Oranienbaum and the trade port in Leningrad. Our anti-battery firing in those days reached its highest phase. Rear Admiral Gren reported now and then today 2 batteries were extinguished. But the next day the fascists brought new ones, and the fight continued. All the patrol ships, boats and minesweepers guarded the fairways round the clock. The weather was abominable cold and stormy. Several times a day I received reports from Captain 3rd Rank Bogdanovich about the situation in the bay. A special staff post was established in the headquarters to control transportation. Most of all, we feared mines on the fairways. Sink any ship, especially on the channel, and our transportation could be delayed for several days. Everything seemed to be going well. And you can imagine my anxiety when I was urgently asked to come to the headquarters of the Water District Protection on Krestovsky Island. If the incident is not reported by phone, it means that something serious flashed an alarming thought. I left immediately. Vasilyevsky Island and the Petrograd side, as it turned out, were under enemy fire. I had to waste time on long detours. When he's in a hurry, it's always like this, grumbled the driver, Sailor Moiseev. In the headquarters of the OVR, I unexpectedly met Engineer Captain of the 2nd Rank F. I, Tepin, known on all seas. There was not a single admiral or officer in the fleet who at one time would not have been trained by Fyodor Ivanovich Tepin in the wisdom of mine work. A sailor of the old fleet, he knew mine weapons perfectly, loved them to fanaticism, made a number of valuable inventions and improvements in this field. "What are you doing here? What are you doing here, Fyodor Ivanovich?" I threw questions at the old man, sensing something wrong. "I was summoned on an alarm." As an ambulance, he replied with dignity. It turned out that on one of the shallow water fairways, it seems Petrovsky, threw out on the shoal mine of unknown type. But is it lying on the ground alone? I ordered, Bogdanovich reports to me, immediately weed all the entrance fairways. So far no more mines have been found. I decided to ask Fyodor Ivanovich to examine our find. The decision, of course, was correct. After hearing the report of the flagship mineral discovered in the fairway mine, Tepin, as always, good-naturedly smiled and only said everything is clear. Let's go, taking with him a subversive mine party. he left on a boat to the scene. And this time the mine was safely inspected, and as it was of no interest, it was immediately destroyed. The mine god Tepin was not otherwise called, this old sailor, stout, short with a shaven head on a short neck, and a weathered, wrinkled face. He was everywhere greeted with respect. Fleet commanders, his former students, always greeted him cordially. Fyodor Ivanovich was loved by everyone for his eternal restlessness and boiling activity. The war caught Tepin already at an advanced age for work on the improvement of our mines in the Research Mine and Torpedo Institute of the Fleet. He immediately left his office and, in his own words, went into the mine war with the Nazis. These meagre words meant a lot. The first German magnetic mines he himself personally dismantled and studied, although they were considered not at all disarmable. To destroy a mine is not a difficult thing, but it was very important for the fleet to know the device of enemy mines, the multiplicity of action of their fuses, to develop reliable countermeasures. I remember Captain Second Rank V. Vinogradov back in September told me how he saw a bundle of hay floating past our ships, standing on the Neva River, not far from the shore, just occupied by the enemy. The neat shape of it seemed suspicious. It floated past the ships, but then, nailed by the current to a barge half submerged on the shoal, suddenly exploded. The barge shattered into splinters. It was clearly a mine. But what kind? How to fight against such mines? Immediately across the river we set up booms and barrier nets, for such a mine could undermine not only the ship, but also the foundations of some Neva bridge. Immediately we invited Tepin, who was already working at that time in the mine and torpedo department of the rear of the fleet. As a skilled hunter, he long guarded his game and still waited. A couple of days later, another suspicious bundle of hay appeared on the river. This time it was carried to the shoal, where it stopped. For a long time the old man looked at the uninvited guest, muttered something and said something, gradually approaching him. Finally Fyodor Ivanovich demanded big boots, organized a cordon around the area, took all his assistants into hiding, and, like a surgeon, began a terrible operation. He carefully, by a blade of grass, dismantled the whole fart and discovered a thin cross. The slightest twist of it when touching an obstacle and the mine explodes. Languid minutes. The mine god keeps saying something. But now he's taken out a part. That's it, guys. Remove this abomination. He shouted loudly to the sailors and walked through the water towards the shore. Tepin during the war was seen not only on the Baltic, but also on other seas and rivers. He was needed everywhere. I remember, in 1943, being the commander of the Volga military flotilla, I asked him to urgently come to the Volga, which the fascists threw mines of a new model. We left for him the most difficult ones. Tepin arrived, and all with the same cunning, good-natured smile safely disarmed insidious devices. A worthy follower of the mine god was in our Baltic flagship miner of the trawling brigade, Captain Third Rank Nikolsky, who personally disarmed a large number of Nazi mines. Disarming of mines in the Baltic passed without losses, although the fascists used the most cunning traps, which should have immediately exploded the mines at the first attempt to open their mechanism. This speaks of the high technical culture of our specialists. 180 voyages made our small fleet and transport sea parts of the 8th Army. By November 4th, its main forces were delivered to Leningrad without losses. We transported from Oranienbaum 6 infantry divisions with artillery and equipment. More difficult were the transports of troops from Hanko and the islands, organized by the fleet headquarters. They required combat support and cover. Continued these transportation until December, until the Neva. Not everything, of course, went smoothly in these heavy winter campaigns. Some losses in ships and in men were inevitable in such an environment. I remember early in the morning of November 4th, Vice Admiral V.P. Drozd burst into my office and from the threshold joyfully exclaimed, "Admiral, congratulations. I brought a present to the front. 4,500 fighting sailors are now landing on your shore." I already knew that 12 ships with the first large echelon of Hanko garrison had safely passed the sea canal and entered the Neva. After the departure of our fleet from Tallinn, It was the largest detachment of warships that had passed the same way. Well, how was the campaign with mines? I asked the Rear Admiral. Do not remind me of them. Gulf of Finland now is a damn ear. We found them by the dozens. I'm afraid that this abomination will spoil a lot of blood for us. Unfortunately, he was right. There were mine casualties, and yet the fleet transported about 16,000 men from Hanko. Winter came earlier than usual. We were most afraid of freezing of the Neva Bay. In the ice, the ships could go only behind icebreakers and only through the sea canal. We went at low speed in full view of the enemy. Meeting of convoys on the approach to Leningrad, and their escorting was the responsibility of the Leningrad naval base. On November 5th, in the morning, the commander of the OVR, Captain 3rd Rank Bogdanovich, reported to me. The boats can no longer break through the ice. The inevitable came. The Neva Bay began to be covered with ice. We had to take off the patrols. It was the hardest time. Small ships could not sail on the water, and it was too early to go on skis on the ice.